So we're doing quadratic models. And this is the data that we're going to talk about. We're not going to do a bunch of different ones with our quadratic models. So we gathered some data about the speed of a car and the mileage it gets at a particular speed. And we want to make a model for this data. We're going to use our calculator. Grab my calculator here. And we're going to use our calculator to model this data. So the first thing that I want to do is enter the data into my calculator. So just as a reminder, we're going to go here to stat, and I entered it in last period, so I'm not going to. You don't have to watch me enter it in. And we're going to go over. So we're at edit, and I just hit enter. And I'm going to enter all this. The speed is going to go in L1, and the mileage is going to go into L2. So I'm going to put those into L1 and L2. If you already have data there, to clear the data out of your list, you go up, you arrow up to the list, hit clear, and then arrow down, and it'll clear out that list. So you just enter in your data, go down. Last class I had 5,555 instead of 55, and that kind of messed things up. And there's all my data entered into my list. I was just making sure everything I had there was right. I'm going to enter the data into L1 and L2. So one thing that calculators and computers are really good at is handling this stuff. The hard part is getting the information in there. All right, so do we have our data in? So now we want to plot this data. So to plot this data, I'm going to go to I'm going to do one thing first. So to plot this data, I'm going to go to seconds, and I'm going to go here to stat plot. And I want to make sure that this number one, the stat plots, is on. So if it's off, we're just going to hit enter and make sure that the cursor is on. Yes?
So I have a TI-89.
Okay.
All the time.
Yeah, here, why don't you do it with this, because I'm not 100%. I know a little bit about the 89, but I don't know how to tell you how to do all those things with 89. So make sure your stat plots are on, and that it says that your X list is L1 and your Y list is L2. So we'll hit enter, and then I want to graph my data. I'm going to hit graph. And now my data doesn't show up. So what am I going to do? Well, our calculator has this nice little feature. If we go to zoom, and you go to number 9, it's a very nice thing. Zoom stat. And it just zooms in on your data. So I hit enter, boom, there's my data. So I didn't even have to figure out what the window is, I just hit zoom stat. So there's this data. What does this data look like it represents? What kind of function? Go to zoom, and then arrow down, it's number 9. So number 9 is zoom stat. So you could just hit number 9 also. 9 is zoom stat, and it'll zoom in on your stat data. And so anytime you have data in your in your L1 and L2 and you're plotting it, ZoomStat will set the window automatically for you. So what kind of function does this look like? Looks like a parabola. It's a quadratic function. We want the calculator to come up with an equation for this. We could come up with an equation. We know how to do this. We've done problems like this before where we would estimate the vertex, use one of the points on the parabola, and then we can find the equation for the parabola. So we're going to let the calculator come up with an even more accurate model. So I'm going to go to back to stat. I'm going to go over to calculate. And because we think it looks like a quadratic function, I'm going to go down to number 5, quadratic regression. We call this a regression. So there's my regression. Now, depending on what kind of calculator you have, there's a couple of steps that you might have to take. So let's do it this way first. I'm just going to hit enter. And there's my quadratic regression. Y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And it tells me a, b, and c. So that's a model for my parabola. Now if you have an 84 plus, it should do this next step the way I show it. This particular calculator on the screen won't do it this way, and I'll have to show you another way. So now we want to graph that regression equation on top of my data. So for some of you, most of you should be able just to go to y equals. And then I'm going to go over here to VARS, variables. Down to statistics, so number 5. And then over to EQ for equation. And there's my regression equation. And for most of you, you should be able to hit enter. And your regression equation should be in y equals. And then you can graph it. Now you notice on mine, it has this box and it doesn't have this exponent. So if yours is like that, let me show you a different step that you have to take here.
How do you get to that?
Show how to get the regression equation?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go to stat. Let me quit out of here. We're going to go to stat. We're going to go over to calculate. And then down here to 5 is our quadratic regression. And your screen will say quadratic regression, and you hit enter. A menu? Oh, I think you must have done a, so if I go to stat, calculate, you did 7, you did a quartic regression. So make sure you're doing quad reg. Okay? And that you could come up with a model, a 4th degree model of that. We're mostly going to do quadratic regression. Okay, so we're going to calculate our regression. There's our regression. And then you should be able to, on most of your calculators, you should then be able to go to y equals. I want that equation in y equals, so it graphs the equation on top of my data. I'm going to go to y equals. And then I'm going to go over here to VARS, variables. Down to statistics, which is 5. And then over to EQ, equation. And the first thing that's there is your regression equation. So most of your calculators should then, when you hit enter, enter your regression equation into your y equals. And you should be able to graph it. So then when you hit graph, it should show your stats and your parabola graph through the same point. So how many of you are there? How many of you have a nice parabola graph there? Good. How many, when you try to graph it, gave you an error? Are you getting an error?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Do I put anything for the power?
no, so here's what you do. If you're getting an error, I'll show you what you have to do. So I'm going to quit out of there. So I'm going to go back to where I calculate the equation. So I'm going to go to Stat, down to, over to Calculate, and over to down to 5. Now before I hit Enter, I'm going to go to Variables, and then I'm going to go over to Y variables. And it's going to store my function in Y1. So I just go to here, hit Enter, and Enter again. So now it's telling, this told the calculator to store the quadratic regression in Y1. And I hit Enter. Now if I go to Y equals in this calculator, it should be in there. And then I can hit Graph. Going to graph it. Still working. I think I broke my calculator. It's stuck. So let me do this. I'm just going to go back and clear that out. So if you have a parabola there, you guys are just fine. You don't have to worry about this. I just want to get the graph in my calculator. I wish mine worked exactly like yours did. Okay. There we go. So there's my parabola graphed on my calculator. That the calculator is telling us this is a good fit for this data. And we see a couple of these points up here that are kind of off the parabola. And then if the question asks us to find the maximum mileage, we could find the maximum mileage. To find the maximum mileage, I'm going to go over here to Calculate. And I'm going to find the maximum. Go down to 4. And it asks us for a left bound and a right bound. So just like we've done before with parabolas. And a guess. And this tells us our maximum mileage is when the speed is about 39.5 miles per hour. Our mileage is going to be about 31 miles to the gallon. So based on our model, that's the maximum mileage. Now we have a couple of points outside here, but what the calculator is telling us is those don't fit the data as well as the other points do. So that's why the maximum is different than these points. The calculator is saying those don't fit the data as well as the other points do. So did everybody get their stats plotted, get their equation, get their parabola graphed on there, so that we could do some things with this. All right. So your homework is basically we're going to be asking you to do these quadratic models for different sets of data. You might have to find a maximum, you might have to find a minimum. It might ask you some other questions about the data that you're using your calculator to find. Does anybody remember how we tell how well this data fits? The R-squared value. So to find the R-squared, the correlation coefficient, it's in the stat menu also. I think. No, it's in the variables menu. Variables, so VARS. I'm going to go down to stats, statistics. I'm going to go to EQ for equation. And then R squared is number 9. For quadratic regressions, we use the capital R squared. For linear regressions, they use the small R squared. I don't know why they use different ones. If I hit enter, oops, I didn't want to do that, clear that. I need to quit out of here. So let me go back there to my correlation, variables, statistics, over to equation. Number 9 is our R squared value. And it tells me our correlation coefficient for this data is 0.97. If it's close to 1, that means it's a pretty good fit. Your R squared is going to be between 0 and 1. So if it's close to 1, it's a good fit. Yes. Did you use capital R squared? Are you sure? Okay. In just a second, we will. I'll check on that. But you had everything else. You had everything else there. Your graph looked good. Your parabola looked good. Okay. We'll look at it in just a second. So, a couple of your homework questions ask you to determine what model would be best. So you get a set of data, and you're not sure. So let me go back here. And let me clear this out of my y equals, and I'm going to graph. So if we have this data, but we only have the first half of the parabola, if we didn't have these points, it kind of looks like it's curving, but it kind of looks like it could be a line also. So to decide which model would be best, I could calculate a quadratic regression, find my R squared value for that, and also calculate a linear regression. I would go through the same steps, but instead of a quadratic regression, I'd do the linear regression and calculate the R squared value for that. If the one that's closer to 1 is going to be the better fit, the calculator's telling you that's the better fit. So we can do different models and see which R squared value is the best. For quadratic regression, we use the capital R. For linear regression, we use the small r squared. Everything is the same. We're just plugging in the points and deciding which model might work the best. So all the homework tonight is just practicing with this, putting some data in and matching some models to it. And we'll look at yours in just a second. All right. Questions on that? Okay. Homework. Just a few of these. And there you go.